in and settled down. So just another moment or two. Brother Al, would you mind leading us in prayer?
Our Father, we thank you for giving us this day, for giving us. We thank you, Father, especially for giving us your word. We pray that we spend an hour this evening and learn from it, learn from points of our life. Thank you to help us. Pray for those that are unable to hear this evening, whether it's physical or spiritual, whatever might be remedy. Pray that you would be with the teachers of the hour, and for those who for the time work we could have gather about. Most of all, we thank you for your Son, Jesus, for the plan of salvation, and hope that we turn to heaven.
Amen. Thank you, brother. All right. At least according to my recollections, we're currently looking at Philippians chapter 2 and about verse 9 is where we left off. In our lesson books, that will be the last question on page 9. But to prepare ourselves for all of that, would anyone like to read Philippians 2, 9 through 18? Philippians 2, 9 through 18. Any volunteers to tackle that? Brother Don.
For this reason also God highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee will bow, of those who are in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and that every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So then, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Do all things without grumbling or dispute, so that you may prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God above reproach in the midst of a perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I will have reason to glory, because I did not run in vain, nor toil in vain. But even if I am poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I rejoice and share my joy with you all. You too, I urge you, rejoice in the same way and share your joy with me.
Right. Thank you very much, brother. So then, let's look at this question 9 on page 9. The text says, according to Philippians 2:9, what was the outcome of Christ's humbling himself? In verses 10 and 11, what two things will result from this? What will the ultimate outcome be? And what does this imply about what will happen to us if we submit ourselves to God? So, in our study last week, what we saw was that Jesus humbled himself to the point of death, even death on the cross. And in verse 9, what resulted from that? What happened because he humbled himself to the point of death? Yes, that he was exalted, and as a result of his exaltation in the last day, there are two things that are going to happen. Yes, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. And even though certainly the day of judgment will be an awesome and fearful day, yet at the same time, I think that that will be a spectacular sight, won't it? On the day when absolutely every human who has ever lived is going to acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord. That all of the people who fought against him steadfastly all their lives, all of the atheists, all of the champions of false religions, all of them, they will also acknowledge that it is Jesus Christ who is Lord. And what will the result of this grand occasion be? To what will this contribute? Yes, that ultimately this is going to be to the glory of the Father. And what does this imply about what will happen to us if we submit ourselves to God? Yes, that we likewise will be exalted. And that's why Paul is saying this. He wants to make the point once again that for Christians, we reach certain places by going about it in exactly the opposite way from what the world would think. Because what does the world say about what you have to do if you want to exalt yourself? Well, being rich is a good way to do that. But whom do you have to focus on? Yes, you have to focus on yourself. You have to live a self-centered life. You have to go around singing your own praises, beating the drum about your own accomplishments and so on and so forth to make sure that everybody knows how wonderful you are. How does it work for Christians, though? It is exactly the opposite. That the way that we show that we are people who are worthy in the kingdom is by humbling ourselves in service, just as the Lord humbled himself in service. Because in the end, is it we ourselves who will exalt ourselves? No. Who will do it? It will be God who will glorify us. Yes? That's exactly right. And don't we see both sides of that in this passage? Because all of these people who are opposing themselves to Jesus and have opposed themselves to Jesus, are those ordinarily very humble, service-oriented people? People like Richard Dawkins, he's a really humble man. Yeah, I hear laughter from those who know of Richard Dawkins. They're as arrogant as they can possibly be. And so what is going to happen to them is that when they finally encounter true power, true majesty, true sovereignty, that they will be humbled. But those who humble themselves before the Lord now, they will be exalted.
One person you don't want to humble is God. A great story to me of this practically the story of Nebuchadnezzar, where he upped himself up, wouldn't give God the glory. God humbled him to the point where he would eat grass like an animal. You don't want God to be the one to humble you. It's best to humble yourself for you.
That is exactly right. Because all of us, every last one without exception, is going to be humbled before God. The only question is how we get there. Whether we choose to humble ourselves or whether we set ourselves up as enemies of God and we cause God to humble us. And if the latter, then that will not be of any benefit to us whatsoever. Anything else on this? All right, let's go on then to Lesson 3. I admit that some of these transitions are pretty arbitrary, but that's what happens when we're trying to chop a letter up into chunks. Question 1. According to Philippians 2:12, what does Paul want the Philippians to do? In what circumstances should they do this? And what does 2:13 reveal about what their motivation should be? And what can we learn from this about righteousness, whether or not we are around others? So, what does Paul say in verse 12 that he wants the Philippians to do? Yes, he wants them to obey, specifically to do what? Yes, work out their own salvation with fear and trembling. And notice that this is a therefore on the basis of everything that he has just said about the humility and the exaltation of Christ. So in what circumstances does Paul want them to do this? To fearfully work out their own salvation? Yeah, any circumstance. Yeah, whether Paul is there or if Paul is not there. And why do this? Why is it important for them to work out their own salvation with fear and trembling? It does please God, but I think there's even a stronger connection that we see in verse 13. For why? Because it is God who is working in you. So why does that make sense? How does it follow that we should work out our own salvation because God is working in us? What's the connection there? Yes, it is. This is certainly something that is accomplished through the Word. We are participating in this process this evening. But what's the link between those ideas of being very careful to work out our own salvation because God is at work in us? Doug? Yes. Yes. And if we are not carefully working out our own salvation, then what is going to happen to God's work in us? Yeah, that we can defeat God's purposes for us. That is one of the implications of free will. There are things that God wants to do with every one of us. There are ways that he wants every one of us to serve him. But is God going to make any of us do that? No. But it reminds me of a saying that I heard once upon a time about the army. And it says that in the army, they can't make you do anything, but they can make you wish that you had. And I think that is the point here. God can't, or God at least won't make us do anything. He allows us to make our own choices. But how far can that take us? Is that ultimately going to be a successful course when we go our own way? No. And that is exactly why we have to be intent on working out our own salvation. Because God has given us this mission. He expects us to carry out our mission. So, finally, what can we learn from this about righteousness, whether or not we are around others?
Regardless of where we are, our attitude and actions should still be focused on godly things.
Yes. And are there times when we see people do what is right for reasons other than the fact that God is at work in them? Like, what are some examples? Yes, that they are interested in the praise of men. Like, what groups in particular might people be concerned about? Like, where do we see this in people we worship with, even? People who are doing the right thing but focused on the wrong person. How does this come up? absolutely. I think that you're right. That it is entirely possible for us to be so caught up in our reputation in the church that we are really doing what we are doing for the sake of that reputation, for the way that others look at us, rather than out of a desire to serve God. And who in the New Testament especially fit this description? People who are famous for serving God in the most obvious way possible. Yes, that is Pharisaism right there. They were the folks, they're on their way to give alms to the poor, and so what do? They literally blow a trumpet so that everybody sees them as they're headed off to the poor box. And let's be honest, friends. That spirit can exist in each one of us, can't it? Because is there any of us that is immune to the knowledge that others are impressed with us and pleased with us?
This is one of the dangers, like if you do things in a public way, whether it's preach, teach, lead singing, if you're not careful, you can be doing it for the wrong motive. So others can brag on you, be impressed with you, and you lose your focus on doing this for God. This is a trap, especially if you do things in a public way, that you can easily fall into.
Absolutely. The more obviously we serve, the easier it is for us to forget that we are serving. And of course, this is a spotlight that shines with particular harshness on preachers. You know, just to make up statistics, you have 50% of preachers who struggle with pride sometimes, and then the other 50% who lie to themselves about it. That's a very real thing, that all of us who serve in a public way need to remember that our first and foremost job is to get out of the light. Because if you stand in the light, then what you are doing is blocking people from what they most need. So we can do it for the sake of the good opinion of our brethren. What's another group that people will commonly go through the motions for the sake of? Who else do they really want to please? Their parents, their families. Yeah, I can remember back when I was at Joliet, there was an older brother named OJ. I have a stack of OJ stories this tall. He was quite a character. But sadly, the day came when he passed on. But one of the things that he was is he was the family patriarch. He was constantly after all of his family members to come to church with him, and he was such a bull in the woods that they would come. You know, he'd have 3 or 4 of them there every Sunday. No, I even baptized one of them. That was the lady who was afraid of water, and baptizing her was interesting. It took me 3 tries before she would let go of the side of the baptistry. But anyway, all that aside, so sadly this brother got brain cancer and died. How often do you think I saw any of the rest of that family after he was gone? Seldom would be optimistic. Yeah, I don't recall any of them ever darkening the door of our church building again, because they were never there for the Lord. They were there for Him. And even while all of us who have family members that we can influence, you know, we have to try to influence them for good. But we have to make sure that we are pointing them toward God rather than just saying, you have to do this to make me happy. And that can be a very difficult balance to walk, a very difficult line to walk sometimes. Marcia. I think a verse that comes immediately to mind here is Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6. My favorite, there are two definitions of faith in Hebrews 11. I think this one is my favorite. I might be off by a verse, but I'm not. Hebrews 11 and verse 6. And without faith it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. And that, I think, is the key. Is we have to be honest with ourselves above all else, in our heart of hearts, about what we are doing. We have to be asking that question, am I truly seeking God? And we can seek God and mess up. But if we aren't really seeking God, then none of the other stuff matters. Because I can be here and I can be going through all the motions and living that virtuous life and all the rest, and yet be like the church in Ephesus that left its first love. And if we have this search for God, then, and this desire to find God, then it is a search that will inevitably lead us through the work. Because you'll run into people in the world who talk about how much they love God, and God is so wonderful, my life is all about God, and they're just as immoral and wicked as they can be. And what that is they have fallen in love with a certain idea of God. They have not fallen in love with the real thing. They are not seeking the one who says, be holy as I am holy. And that's always an aspiration, but it is one that we have to take seriously and one that we have to love. So, does that, because that's a classic question. I think that's one of the great tensions of our faith is, how do we resolve on the one hand saying, well, it's about Jesus saving me, and so I don't have to do anything, or it's about all these good works that I've been given to do, so it's not about Jesus. And on the one hand, those are opposites. On the other, really, they're two sides of the same coin. Andy?
Along those lines, this passage here talks about working out your own salvation, working in some way, doing something, because God is working in us. And so you've got two sides there. One camp wants to say, well, God does it all for you. The other camp says, well, we do it all ourselves. But there's a combination. God is part of that, like we've been talking about.
And the more we work, the more God is working in us. And all the way through here, we've been hitting paradoxes, haven't we? The paradox of how, if we want to exalt ourselves, and the way to do that is to humble ourselves and put others first. And I think this is another one. That in working out our own salvation, what we are truly doing is allowing God to work in us.
And I think part of that, too, is watching out for false humility. Trying to find women to teach women's classes is impossible. Because, oh, no, you don't want me. No, you don't, I'm not the person you're looking for. Because we have such this idea of, oh, I can't owe what God has put in me, that we can't acknowledge the work that God has done in us. God has done work in me to be able to speak publicly. Okay, so I need to go use that. And if I have so much, oh, I don't want to be a Pharisee and blow my trumpet, literally, that means that I can't acknowledge the work that God has accomplished in me.
And that is an interesting point, and there are a lot of things that come together in that. I think that one of the most violated passages in Scripture it's about Titus 2:4, which talks about the importance of the older women teaching the younger women. And I have known several younger women who have basically worked their way through the congregation, trying to find an older woman who will teach them. And they just go right through the list and strike out with everybody because everybody says, oh, I could never, I don't know anything. And sometimes the most astonishing people say, I don't know anything, even though it is like this sister in Christ who is just amazingly spiritually accomplished and can do anything except apparently impart what she knows to somebody else. So we have to be willing to be honest about where we can contribute. Lee?
This is kind of like what a lot of people call an oxymoron. We have problems wrapping our minds around what it means else to go to work out your own salvation. All of us do those, we have to do it ourselves.
Yes.
And yet, you want to serve the Lord is the glory of God.
Yes. 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 I think that is exactly right. Whether you call it an oxymoron or whether you call it a paradox, similar concepts. And in fact, as you go through the Bible, the more you study it, the more you realize that Christianity is built on paradox. That it starts with the idea of a God who is infinite and incomprehensibly great somehow coming to earth in the form of a baby.
The cross itself is a paradox.
Yes.
The concept of the cross.
Yes, that the Creator dies in His own creation. You could list thing like that after thing like that after thing like that. And it is in paradox, I think, that we start having to acknowledge that we are grappling with something beyond the limits of our own understanding. That we sense that there is truth there, but we don't have enough horsepower quite to put it into words. Doug?
I think that's the essential thing, because when you start talking to people who are atheists or whatever, it's all about they have the answer, they have the understanding, they have the grasp on what all of this is about, and they're not even close. Nobody is close. They're just so far removed from understanding.
Absolutely. That's one of the bizarre things about atheists is they say, I live in a universe that I can understand. I have everything that I need to grasp everything that is happening around me. And by contrast, the essence of being a Christian, as we see here, is humility. Saying, there are some things I can understand. There are some things I can kind of get a fingernail on. And then there are some things that are completely beyond me. And I'm just going to trust God to handle that. Saw another hand. Gail? And the funny thing is that Paul saying, I die daily, is not really that difficult a concept. But, yes, be very suspicious of those who will claim that they have all the answers. I'm pretty emphatically not on that list. That there are lots of things that I do not know and do not understand. I hope to become greater in my understanding. I do not anticipate ever understanding everything. That too. All right. Anything else here? Okay, question 2. What commandment does Paul give in verse 14? According to 15, what will result from this? According to verse 16, what does this kind of behavior constitute? What will the result of such behavior be for Paul, and what should we learn from this about the importance of harmonious relationships between brethren? So, what is the commandment there in Philippians 2 and verse 14? Not one of my favorites, by the way. Yes, do all things without grumbling and or disputing. What do y'all think of that? This is one of those really easy ones, right?
Oh, yeah, just ask the elders and the preachers. That's easy.
Yes.
We hear more lighter than anybody else, probably. The fact of the matter is, grumbling has been plaguing the people of God for a very long time. And you don't believe when I say that, just read
Yes.
the book of Exodus.
I'm not sure who complains more, whether it's the people about the preachers or the preachers about the people.
Probably a time.
Yes. Speaking of humility, I think that this text is certainly a call to it. But if we do reach this point, this is certainly, in all earnestness, this is something for which we should be working. We need to be working on getting rid of the grumbling from our lives, getting rid of the complaining from our lives, getting rid of the disputing from our lives. Because what will happen if we do? Well, we might find that our lives go better without all of that grumbling and complaining and belly aching. But what does it Paul say will happen in verse 15? Yes, we will show that we are blameless, harmless people, and also reveal what about ourselves? Who does that prove we are? Yes, that we are children of God without blemish. And what is true of all of the complainers and grumblers around us? Yes, they are a crooked and perverse generation. And one of the things that shows that they are a crooked and perverse generation is all the grumbling and disputing they do.
And can I just say this, Matt? I think it's also interesting. Why do people grumble? I think one of the reasons why people grumble is because it's easy to grumble. It's easy to complain and to talk about what you don't like, or what you don't like about what somebody else is doing, or how you get somebody else to do something better, or do it your way. That's easy.
Yes, it is.
It's a lot harder to be part of the solution.
Yes.
And to step up your game and to look at yourself in the mirror.
Yes. Yes. All very true. That when we complain about what somebody else is doing wrong, you know what that is? That's cheap righteousness. Because I can go through the auditorium and tell all of you just how you need to make your lives better so that you can be a perfect disciple like me. And that puts all the work on you. But when I consider my own self, then making those changes is not quite so easy, is it? Gail and then Tony. Yes, absolutely. Because is the key here superhuman self-control? That's the way that we do all things without grumbling or disputing. Where you feel the bitterness towards some other brother, it's coming out, and so you bite your tongue. Is that really the way that we solve the complaining problem? Does that do us any good ultimately? No. Because what happens is you might have kept the bitterness from expressing itself, but guess where it still is? And it's going to find some other way of getting out. That the way to deal with the complaining is to get rid of the pride and the self-centeredness and the self-righteousness and be truly concerned about others and ask not what do they need to do to be like me, but ask, what can I do to help? And ask that as sincerely as Jesus. Tony?
You basically, I was just going to say that I think complaining and disputing comes from being self-centered.
Absolutely. And I think the more self-centered we become, the more we complain. Because I think all of us can think of people we've known who basically acted like the world revolved around them. They had this inflated notion of their own self-importance. And usually were people like that just very, very happy and content and self-satisfied? That they are miserable. And what does their conversation about others look like? Yes, that somebody who is that self-centered, what they are going to do is they are going to unceasingly complain about other people because that they are not treating this self-centered person with all of the care and courtesy and concern that this self-centered person thinks he needs. Yes. And it's always everybody else's fault. And so I think that's exactly so, Tony.
It can also make us stand out in a way that is uncomfortable. So, our hot mess culture, where it is not okay for young moms, especially, to be like, no, my kids are good and respectful and things are going well and we have a good life. And no, you have to complain about your kids, you have to complain about how busy you are, you have to, and if you don't do that, it's like, oh, well, thanks for filling the conversation. Like, we don't have anything to talk about if we're not complaining about everything in our lives. And that would make us weird. And it can be hard sometimes to say, well, yes, that would make for a conversation, but not a particularly good one. So I'm not going to say that right now.
One of the weirdest artifacts of our society is the conversation where everybody gets together and complains about how busy they are. And this is not normal. Most societies throughout time have not been full of people who simultaneously, A, complained about how busy they were, and B, prided themselves on how busy they were. That for most people in American society, being crazy busy so that you have to rush around with your hair on fire all the time, that's like a merit badge. That shows that you are a virtuous person because you are living this unhealthy, imbalanced life. And yet it is so easy for all of us to slip into that conversation where we're trying to top each other's stories of how much we have on our plate and how much we're struggling. Sean, then Bobby.
I was just going to say, one of the things that's helped me with growing, but I'm not claiming at all to be perfect when it comes to this, but is to be thankful, do my best to be thankful. You know, when you find yourself complaining, and I'm talking in general now, you find yourself complaining about your job. What do you think when you have a job? Some people don't have a job. You find yourself complaining, oh, my kids act up, or keep up a lot of noise. You think you have children, and they're healthy. You find yourself complaining about you in your country, and you say this and that. We think we live in the greatest country in the world. We have religious freedom. I mean, you can always turn it around, all about how your perspective is, and are you ultimately thankful? Because that was Israel's solution. I mean, they're complaining, grumbling, but God wanted them to be thankful. They never really learned that. We have to learn.
Yes. That here you had these people who were in the desert, and there was no possible way that they could have provided for themselves. They would have starved to death in a matter of a few weeks if they had been left to their own devices. And so God literally sent bread from heaven down to sustain them. It tasted wonderful. And they have this amazing blessing, and what do they do in their conversation about this amazing blessing? They complain about it. Oh, we're sick of this manna. And frankly, friends, a lot of the time are we much better? God gives us all this wonderful stuff, and what we do instead is we focus on the tiny corner of things that aren't going well, and we complain about them rather than rejoicing in all of the things that we have. Because how many of our first century brethren would not have traded physical circumstances with any of us? I mean, every single one of us in a heartbeat. You know, how wealthy are we? How much security and peace do we enjoy? And yet, the sad truth about humankind is that we adjust to it all and we take it all for granted. You had a comment, Bobby? No? Okay. Dr. Clifford.
It's very hard to be blameless. It's very hard to be harmless. And it's very hard to not have somebody saying bad things about you, particularly if you're a public eye at all. And at the same time, we need to love ourselves
Absolutely right. That even if we have managed our grumbling problem, it is nearly certain that there will be those around us who have not managed it. And it is easy to allow their unhappiness to poison ours. And, once again, this is a universal struggle. How many of us like to have somebody disagree with us on Facebook? And can see that without feeling this tiny hint of resentment in our hearts? I'm here to tell you, not I. I may need to start watching that in myself, in fact. Andy?
There's two types of grumbling and complaining. Grumbling and complaining against God, which is never allowed or never. You just don't want to go there because it's God's will and we're supposed to bow to that. And then there's grumbling and complaining against other people. And you can deal with that. Grumbling and complaining isn't the way to do it. There may be a better way to accomplish something. They may be doing it in a self-optimal way, and you can address that. But you do it with them. Like, whenever Sean makes a mistake, I go directly to him.
Now you see why I'm so passionate about this, because people like him.
Yeah, Sean's next sermon, Philippians 2, there it is.
It's all because we hold fast to the wrong thing. We hold fast to grumbling and complaining. That's verse 16. Hold fast to the Word of God. Hold fast to the Word of God.
Absolutely. And there is a vast difference between addressing somebody's problem with a heart that cares about them versus addressing somebody's problem with a heart that cares about us. Where we say, here's how I think things should be. You are not living up to my vision of a perfect reality, so you need to change. As opposed to, here, let me help you be a better disciple. You can see the same problem and react to it totally differently.
When I grumble and complain, I don't think about how it harms other people. I think that's what we think about more. Is how my grumbling and complaining harms others that are around me.
Yes, it does. Because, once again, as you said earlier, the problem is it's self-centered. And when we're doing anything self-centered, we're necessarily not thinking about other people. And we are not thinking about the effect of our words on them. In Ephesians 4, Paul talks about unwholesome speech, corrupt speech. And grumbling and complaining is very often that kind of corrupt speech. And you have the story about let's go back to Sean and my favorite illustration, people complaining about the preacher. And you have this family, and they come to services 3 times a week, and then on the car ride home every Sunday they have roast preacher for dinner. And so they habitually roast the preacher, and then when the kids get old enough to make their way in the world, they go their way, and they never darken the doorway of a church building again. And the parents are, why? And the reason is because all that they heard growing up from the mouths of their parents about the church was negative. So grumbling doesn't just poison us, it poisons others. And on that very interesting but 3 questions in kind of note, I think we'll wrap things up this evening. Thank you all for your comments.